time and effort to create this book. And I especially have to say, and it's created by Cathy Russo. She has done huge amount of work buying ingredients, testing recipes, keeping notes, and just most of these recipes in here were tested by her. There was a number of other people that did help, such as Laura and Sarah Palmer, Mary Jones, Pam Coombe, Leslie Loeffel, all of them, and I think Sharon Rory also helped, but she did the majority. So I really have to say she unfortunately cannot be here today. She's sick, she's on quarantine. She was going to give a little talk about how she tested these recipes and the difficulty she encountered testing recipes that were, have some age to them. But unfortunately, she cannot be here today, and I'm sorry about that, but I did want to say how much she put into this book. It was huge. And there were a number of other people that really, really helped, especially like Pat McCoy, Judy Chanowski, people that did a lot of proofing, adding to the book. And the next person would be Penny Coombe, who's standing to my left. She wrote the look back section, did a lot of research on that, and she put the program together today for this program. So I'm going to turn it over to Penny. She's going to give a program on the meal preparation from the 1920s to the 40s as compared to today. Have a little fun with measuring in the middle. And then after that, we'll go right to the goodie tasting. To your left, a number of people have made some of the recipes from this book, and we'll talk a little bit about those, and everybody can get to taste them. So please enjoy. If you want to purchase a copy of the book, they're here. They're also up in our gift shop. Okay, so
thank you, Donna. It's nice to see everybody here this afternoon. I have had a lifelong interest in food and history and meal preparation and planning and all those things. And so I've had a goal of making a cookbook for years and years. So I worked on this one. I don't know if I'll ever get to do any more or not. So anyway, it's nice to have you here this afternoon. The end of the 19th century was a time of tremendous change in our society and in our homes. We had the Industrial Revolution, which started to take women out of the home and have them move to more urban areas where they might get a job as a maid or a cook in somebody's house. We had the Pure Food and Drug Act because people started to be really concerned about what was in the increasing number of commercially available foods. And if you remember learning in social studies about the muckrakers, this was the time Teddy Roosevelt was the president, and they passed this. And this law has now been superseded and is administered by the FDA, which is a food safety thing. Home Economics Association was founded in Lake Placid, New York in 1910 by Ellen Richards, who was the first woman graduate of MIT. She was a chemist by training, and she was a professor at that time at MIT. And she and Booker T. Washington's wife and a couple of women with some training at Cornell University were the founders of the American Home Economics Association in 1906, which is the same year that 1910. In the early 1990s, just about 100 years later, they changed the name of that to Family and Consumer Sciences, and now nobody knows what to call us. But the home economists were snapped up by food companies to help them develop recipes so it would get people to buy their products. One of the most well-known examples of that is Toll House cookies, the recipes on the back of every package of semi-sweet bits that you buy. And I have a book here that you might like to look at. It's called Recipes Gourmet, Back of the Box Cookbook. Now, all those recipes were really good, or most of them were really good until they got into the Jell-O craze a little bit later. Because if the recipe wasn't any good, you weren't going to buy any more of that product. All right, so they had to be good. So they were hired by food companies such as Corning, who were making products for kitchens, and even the electric companies. I have a friend, Ruth Clements, who some of you may have known, who used to be the home economist for the electric company in Liberty. And I had a friend that graduated with me from Cornell who was testing recipes in high altitudes for corning in the 1960s and beyond. So at this time, the majority of Americans lived on farms. In 1940, of 76 million people lived on farms. By 1950, only 16% lived on farms. And last year, I wrote the wrong thing. All right, last year, it's down to 1.5%. Okay, and dropping fast. Because farmers, Barthel's has a sign on their thing. There's no money in farming. Okay. But anyway, I don't know what everybody thinks they're going to eat when they get rid of all the farmers. Those farm women, let's see, Donna, we got kitchens up here. I'm going to sit so I can see too. All right, the cabinet on the right there, can you go back for a second? The cabinet on the right, because I think it's only in this slide, is known as a Hoosier. And it was invented, and that was in 1902. And that was the very first kitchen cabinet. And other manufacturers sold them as well. And they sold, I think, something like 3 million in the first 20 years that they had them. My old neighbor on South Hill had one. It was just like this, except it only had one. Those big things between the counter part and the upper part were to store flour and maybe sugar, or maybe you had white flour and whole grain flour in there. And there's a sifter on the bottom, the little handle on the right. The counter height part pulled out, so you had a workspace, because before that, the only thing you had was your kitchen table. And you were lucky if you had running water in your cast iron sink. And you'll see pictures as we go through, Donna, of there's a sink that doesn't appear to have any drain boards, but it does have more cabinets. By the 1930s, many kitchens had more cabinets. There's one that's supported on its own legs. Keep going, Donna. All right, here's somebody cooking on maybe a very early electric stove. And here's a fancy one. Look at the matching canisters and even the upholstery on the rocking chair. It's all, the wastebasket, it's all coordinated. Probably looks like about the 40s. There's a simpler Hoosier cabinet there. A gas, an early gas stove. You can see the refrigerator off to the left with the motor on the top. I had one of those when I was first married. It didn't have the thing on the top, but it had a very, very small freezer compartment. You could either have ice cream or ice cubes. Yes, we had ice cream. Most people in 1900, 1910 had a wood or coal burning stove in their kitchen. And we do have some pictures of some of those. There's one. This is a pretty early one. It doesn't have a tank for hot water. They were very cantankerous. Or here's one that's gas on the left. The one on the right might be combination wood and gas. And I think some of them had a big metal tank where you could put water and it would be hot, so you didn't have to heat water on the stove. Maybe they had an ice box. Here's a real early fireplace oven. The kitchen table was used for work and usually for dining as well. Refrigerators are not widely available until the 1930s, and neither were linoleum floors. Before that, kitchens had wood floors, or the very early kitchens, of course, probably had brick floors or dirt. Okay, so try to imagine yourself preparing 3 meals a day for as many as a dozen people in these accommodations. You had your husband, your children, maybe your mother or father, and the hired man to feed. And there might have been, and people commonly had 5 to 10 children in those days. By the 1930s, they did have quite a few tools to help us. Donna? Okay. Many of you recognize the green handles. They were very widespread in households in the 20s and the 30s. They're the green, and there are some had red. My mother had, we've got a red tool over there that has red handles. Can you recognize all of these that we have similar things today? See, the grapefruit knife is the third from the right. I have one of those. It doesn't look like that, but my son-in-law, before he was my son-in-law, was going to help me, and he straightened it out for me. Then he bought me a new one. The item down on the bottom right has an egg beater that has a container, so it contains the spatters. The potato masher, they still make those that look like that. And of course, strainers. And my grandmother had one of those can openers. It was almost impossible to use. It's on the lower left. I could never make that work. Yeah, it's probably my left hand. I do have one tool, and I forgot to bring it today. It's called a jar wrench. It was my grandmother's, who was married in 1907. Most of the green paint has worn off the handle, but it still opens the jars that my arthritic hands will not open. So we can go to the next slide, Donna. One extremely popular creation. Oh, did I get out? No. All right. All right, so we'll do that. Sorry. I don't know, where is it? I didn't think it was after it. Maybe it is. All right, we'll get to it in a minute. I'll talk about Pyrex. You'll see it when we get to it. One extremely popular creation was Pyrex, which was invented when the company was working to develop stronger glass to use in railroad lanterns and other purposes. And a man named Jesse Littleton gave his wife a casserole made from the new glass. She loved it, and Pyrex was born in 1915. By 1919, 4 million pieces were in use in American kitchens. It was extremely popular because it was easy to clean, it didn't rust, and it was also useful for serving. The iconic yellow, red, blue, and green mixing bowls and other colors developed mostly after World War II. Corning created an incredible variety of shapes and sizes, and it's still popular today. How many have a Pyrex dish in their kitchen? At least something, even if it's the red line measuring cup. And older styles are highly prized by collectors, even the ones from the 60s and 70s. Okay, now Donna, meal patterns. We think this book is from the 20s or possibly the early 30s. Some suggested menus for family meals. This come out of a cookbook?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. So noticing they're having a meal pattern that's not that different than ours. People in that time period either had breakfast, dinner at noon, and supper at night, or they had breakfast, lunch, and then have dinner at night. So lunch and supper were similar meals, lighter usually than the dinner. And people who lived on farms worked hard all day, and they needed that fuel of the big dinner to have enough food to do their work. You may have seen a piece of furniture that's like a settee, but with a raised end, kind of a curved. I've heard that called a hired man's bed, and that was where he could take his nap after dinner before they went out to do the afternoon chores. So notice there is a hot bread at almost every meal, at least one. If you look at the first one, the Sunday breakfast, it's a little bit hard to focus. Waffles. At the other one, they have refrigerator rolls, and at supper, they have cheese biscuits, okay? They weren't going to the store and buying these things, people. They were making them in those terrible kitchens that they had. Okay, if you go over here to Thursday, for breakfast, they stewed prunes. That's a favorite of everyone. There's no bread there. They had oatmeal. Oh, they had toast. All right, and then for lunch, they had sandwiches, deviled ham, and for dinner, macaroni and ham. So they're not so terribly different. I have some other books that I have. This is a manual that was written by Dr. Richards, which has an introduction by her, to train people to teach domestic science, which they called home economics in the high schools. And this actually predates the Home Economics Association, was published in 1909. Domestic science and household arts for elementary schools. You wouldn't believe what's in here. I couldn't have taught this stuff to my high school seniors. There are meal plans in here, what to do in the, how to set up your kitchen. Here's the kitchen. Well, I can't really read this, but I'll leave this out so you can take a look with the marker in there so that you can see what that is. And then I found this one, which is an old textbook from high school. There's a Thanksgiving dinner here that I want to share with you. Okay, Thanksgiving is coming up. So here's, I have to go over here. I can see. Aha. An elaborate Thanksgiving menu. So get ready to cook. I cannot read this. Okay. Scallop cocktail, tomato bouillon, crisp potato paprika crackers, celery, olives, salted nuts, roast stuffed turkey, chestnut dressing, giblet gravy, jellied cranberry sauce. That all sounds kind of familiar. Grilled sweet potatoes, onions and cream, mashed turnips, frozen punch, romaine salad, French dressing, cream cheese rolls, crackers, pumpkin pie, whipped cream, fruit, nuts, cluster raisins. I wonder if that was grapes, and cafe noir. Now here's a simple menu on the same page. Fruit cocktail, celery and olives, roast turkey, jellied cranberry sauce dressing, giblet gravy, grilled sweet potatoes, mashed turnips, lettuce salad, French dressing, pumpkin pie or caramel ice cream, and mince. So some of the foods are still familiar, and the date on this book, I think, is 1937. So if you can imagine preparing even what we would consider Thanksgiving dinner, but let alone that more elaborate dinner back in those kitchen facilities.
That first dinner, though, sounded delicious. Yeah.
Well,
somebody come and bring and make that for me
Who
for
could eat all those courses? So we were talking about that. So the first American cookbook, and I have a picture of that. The first American cookbook was published in 1796 in Connecticut, and then the second edition came out the same year in Albany, New York. And this is what it looked like. I don't know, and I'll put this down on the table. It's really interesting. It was written by a woman who was an orphan. They made a big deal about that. She published, I think, the first edition herself, but it sold over millions of copies, and it has now been listed as one of the 88 most significant books published in America by the Library of Congress. And if you really like to see what's in it, you can go to the Smithsonian Magazine, and it pops up in a sidebar on the right-hand side of the page, and you can read the whole book. And it's fascinating because it tells you how to dress the fowl and the fish and so forth, and then what to do with them. So it's quite interesting. You can also buy a hardcover one. The recipes were interesting because she was writing for a new place, new cuisine, new ingredients, and differentiating American cooking from that of Great Britain. So let's consider some of those early recipe directions. And we have a little quiz for you to look at. So if the recipe calls for the size of a hen's egg, okay, is it a pullet? Is it a tiny egg? Is it an old hen? Maybe she's laying extra large eggs. And so how much egg?
You know the answers, right, Penny?
No.
Oh, no.
I mean, I do know some of them. You've got them right here. You can look in the front of your book. I know I've got them here. I didn't mark them though. We usually figure Olin D. Rath used to raise pullets. And when we were going to have a bake sale up at the Reformed Church up by the school, he would bring buckets of eggs down. They were teeny eggs. And so we used to measure them. And so if you called for 2 eggs, you needed, I think it's a quarter of a cup, right, per egg? Yes. Okay. That one's not so hard. All right. What's next? A cube of butter.
Someone guess. What do you think? 1 stick, a half a stick, or 2 tablespoons? It's a half a cup.
It is.
1 stick. 1 stick or a half a cup.
Wow. I was with all of you people.
Yes. Yes. Well, a cube of butter, according to the information that we found, was a half a cup.
And many recipes today, you know. All right, what's next?
Smidgen.
It's 1/16 of a teaspoon. They don't even make things. That's just like,
No, that's not the right answer.
it's not the right answer.
No, it's 1/32.
Whoa.
So it's a smidgen.
It's a little teeny bit.
We have bigger fingers now.
It's not even as much as a pinch or a dash.
Well, what is a dash? Let me see if I can find dash. Dollop, handful. I mean, it's really very arbitrary. Okay.
And Cathy either found or developed this chart. So it's, you know, you can keep this, and if you're trying to interpret any old recipes, it could be helpful to you.
Depending on if the person who made the recipe feels the same way about a fistful, you know.
If you have my son is doing it, you're going to have twice as much as if I am doing it. So that's what I intended to do. Fistful,
Find it.
quarter cup.
So that's a very small fist, I think.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, next.
And what is a coffee cup?
So what do you think? What's a
Depending
coffee
on
cup?
what household you lived in.
Yeah,
Who says 1 cup? Raise your hand if you think it's 1 cup. It is.
It
1
is.
cup.
it is. But
Not anymore.
was it your teacup that came with your good dishes, or was it a mug, which they had back then? Or I have a cup that my friend Al Porter gave me that Stoddard, her husband's grandmother, gave him when he started to drink coffee, and it holds at least 2 cups, if not more. It's the size of something I would put soup in, maybe. And it's fancy china. Okay,
What is a chunk? Now that to me would be, a chunk would be bigger than a cube, if you ask me, but that's not the case.
it's not. A chunk is 2 to 3 tablespoons.
2 to 3 tablespoons, yet the cube of butter was a half a cup, so.
Okay. Scant.
Now, these are all terms that are in recipes, and when Cathy was doing the, trying to figure out, it must have been difficult. These are actual measurements, so we're not making them up.
I would say it's B, and by the way, B and C are exactly the same.
Oh, is that true? All right, well, that was just me.
All right, so they're the same, so they're both right. But by the way, we don't see too many recipes nowadays that call for cake flour, but, and it's not something I keep in hand. I don't even know if they still sell it, but 1 cup minus 2 tablespoons. And then you put 2 tablespoons of cornstarch in, stir it up, and that will equal cake flour. And only if you're making a really delicate, like an angel food cake or sponge or chiffon cake where the measurement is absolutely critical, do you need cake flour. I usually just use not even a scant cup, just a level cup of flour that I've stirred up. You never, ever, ever pack flour into a measuring cup.
Is that true?
Yes.
Why?
Because it compacts it. You can put in 2 or 3 extra tablespoons if you pack it in. Try it sometime. What's the one ingredient you do pack when you're measuring it?
Brown sugar.
Brown sugar, and there's one other one. Crisco or butter. I mean, we don't measure butter too often now because it comes in sticks and we just cut off what we need. But if you're measuring Crisco, which also now comes in sticks, thank you, God, that, but if you have to dig it out of that 3-pound can, you pack that into the measuring cup and peanut butter. I don't think I ever saw that one before. A thought.
A smidgen is smaller than a thought. That doesn't make sense to me. There you go.
A thought is a half dash.
Yes, half dash or 1/6.
So it's a double smidgen.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I typed it at 1/6. It's supposed to be 1/16.
Okay. It's interesting because Dick and I went to have dinner at our daughter's house last night, and she and her daughter had made an apple pie, which was delicious. But she said I was messing with the recipe because I didn't have quite as many apples as it said. And so I was putting in a lot of cinnamon, and then I put in a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And she said, I need to write it down because it really was exceptionally good. So she was using thoughts and dashes and a smidgen of this or whatever to get it done, but it had a good result. If you are an experienced cook, you can do that. I used to tell my high school students, well, my middle school students too, that if you're making pasta sauce and you like lots of garlic, you can put in as much as you want, within reason. But if you are baking, you are creating a chemistry experiment. And so the proportion and the amount of fat, flour, and leavening, which is baking powder, baking soda, or yeast, makes a big difference. So you can't just say, I'll put in twice as much. And you do need to put the salt in. And you could add a little bit more. When I was in college, I took an organic chemistry course. Lectures were all chemistry and memorizing stacks and stacks. I had a stack of index cards like this, but the labs were all food based. So one day we were making cakes and it was set up just like a chemistry lab, and you had a lab partner and you got your assignment, and probably 2 or 3 groups were assigned to make the recipe the way it was written. Somebody was supposed to put in a half a cup more sugar or a half a cup less sugar, or add a little more flour, or double the vanilla or the salt, or so forth down the list. Put in an extra egg or forget the egg. And you really learned then how the ingredients work together to make whatever it is that we were trying to bake. And it was one of the most interesting classes, and I was glad because they do teach now, I think at Tri-Valley, a food chemistry course, because it's a much more logical way to learn chemistry than in the abstract. Oh, here's our Pyrex. Okay. You could buy that covered casserole for only 50 cents. They still sell that piece. Maybe they make it in blue because they were doing that a few years ago. But you can see we can recognize all those pieces on the bottom, even the custard cups.
And those were the bowls you were mentioning?
Those are the iconic mixing bowls. How many had one of those in your mother's house here or grandmother's house? How many still have one?
I do all kinds of little blue ones. If you try to buy it at a yard sale, they're $40 or $50.
And the whole set must go for a small fortune then. Yeah. I saw a picture in a magazine within the last year, but not recently, of somebody that was showing all their collection, might have even been in the New York Times. And she had like a whole wall, at least as long as that wall that the slides are on, of different Pyrex all on shelves displayed. That was her collection. The way some people collect Fiesta ware, or I collect handmade pottery, you know, whatever it is, but it's very collectible. All right, so here's a lady taking her bread, putting a little butter on top, and she's got 5 loaves in her batch. And you can see she's got a cake back there on the right hand side.
And something in the corner there too.
Yeah, something in this front corner. And there's her sink in the background on 2 legs. We have similar sink. We have similar kitchens. So if you really want to see what one of these kitchens looks like, the kitchen up in the house on the hill is we did a good job with that, with the examples. So, and every house had a bread box. We use that expression. Is it bigger than a bread box? And everybody knew what that meant because they all had bread boxes. And I found this ad the other day, and I thought this was interesting. Making delicious dishes can be made with bread, and bread will reduce the high cost of eating, and so on and so on. And so those are all things that you can use bread to create, like your pie crust or, you know, whatever else you're doing there. It's interesting to look at some of those things. So what were these people cooking in these primitive kitchens? Rural areas, farm families were mostly self-sufficient and subsistence farmers. In case you don't know what subsistence farmers were, they produced everything they needed on the farm, with the possible exception of vanilla, cinnamon, spices, and things like that, which were much more limited than what most of us have in our cabinets today. They cooked what they had. They raised beef, pork, chickens, eggs, dairy. They often had venison or other game and local fish. Even when I was first teaching in the mid-60s, I had a student one time that wanted to bring in a squirrel for us to cook. I declined. They churned their own butter, baked their own bread, and remember how many family members they had. They grew vegetables and preserved them in root cellars, or by canning, drying, smoking. Pickling. The daily diet was rich in meat and potatoes and garden vegetables in season. The nearest general store may have been miles away and used only for such items as spices and leavening agents. And by the way, reliable yeast was not produced until the late 19th century. Fleischmann's was one of the first American companies to produce reliable yeast. And how many of you remember cake yeast? Not too many. It came in a little square, about 1 inch by 1 inch, a cube, and wrapped in aluminum foil. And you had to dissolve it in water and make sure it was good before you tried to use it. Way back in the early days, they used to catch wild yeast. And that's how they developed sourdough bread, because they had to keep the starter going or they wouldn't be able to bake the bread. And they needed bread, remember, 3 times a day. Some canned foods began to be available, primarily peas, corn, beans, and tomatoes. One study showed that 44 hours were spent each week in preparing food and cleaning up. Now that's more than a 40-hour work week right there. And these women also cared for their children and maybe parents or aunts and the garden, and often helped with chores. Many farm women were responsible for the chickens, and they had to deal with the milk. The farmer might bring it into the house and you had to strain it, maybe separate the cream, maybe then you churned butter, and maybe you sold that to get a little extra money to buy things that you needed that you couldn't take care of yourself. And if they ever sat down, there was always mending, or maybe they were knitting or quilting. Town families may have had a bake shop and a farmer that delivered milk, eggs, and butter, but probably not until later in the near like the 40s and 50s. Food would have been much plainer and less spicy than our food today. There may have been mint or horseradish sauce. They grew horseradish in their gardens, and so that was something that they had. And wild mint they could also have. Meat would generally be cooked well done, and vegetables overcooked by our standards. Probably 20 years ago, I was with my uncle, and he was making, we were making a scalloped and rice dish, and because they lived on an island where they got scallops, and we were cooking broccoli. So he told me I was to cook the broccoli. So we haven't even started cooking the rice yet. And Uncle Rodney is like, put that broccoli on the stove. And I'm like, what? You know, I'm not cooking the broccoli till 5 minutes before. Oh no, I don't like that hard vegetable, you know? So that was worst broccoli I ever ate. So you may have heard of Fannie Farmer's cookbook. Oh yeah, we'll talk about Bisquick. Bisquick was also a very early invention, probably by a home economist. It's almost as old as Pyrex. I don't remember the exact date. And I love this ad. It takes more than 90 seconds to mix up the Bisquick, but not much more. But the mother-in-law, the daughter-in-law's biscuits are better than her mother-in-law's. That's a brave man that actually said that. Okay, Donna, what do we got? Here's the Crisco. Was promoted because before that, what did they use? Lard, which is notably unhealthy. But they still do produce it. My mother, I think until the day she died, used lard to make her pie crust because it made the flakiest pie crust. So Crisco was heavily advertised and came first in that round can. I think we probably have downstairs or maybe in the museum an old shortening can. Kids used to use that to take their lunch to the one-room schoolhouse.
This is a stupid question. What is Crisco?
It's fat made from vegetable oil. Yeah, it's vegetable shortening. So if you melt Crisco, you get something that you could substitute for oil if you're out of oil. Or you can substitute butter. Okay, I told Donna to put this in the slideshow because around the time of World War I, women started working in factories because the men were at war, and this only got more so in World War II. And they're producing Crisco here, and look what they're wearing. I mean, isn't that dress right out of the 1900s? I mean, my grandmother's wedding dress looked something like that in that style. So that's from 1915. And here's an ad from 1936, which I know you can't read, but the ads were really changing. They started to add more color. There are 3 recipes on that page and a cartoon. And magazines of that day. Judy, could you hold up that magazine that's there? This is a Ladies' Home Journal from 1932 that I found. And the gingerbread recipe in the cookbook is one I took from there, and I tested it to see that it worked. It has I think next time I made it, I might use a little less molasses or a lighter one. But Dick liked it. I thought it was a little too molassesy. But notice the size of the magazine, and what's the price? Yeah, and what's the price? 10 cents. But remember, 10 cents was quite a lot of money back in 1923, I think.
Well, it's April 1932.
Oh, 32.
Yeah.
That was in the Depression.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and if you want to look through it, do so gradually. We also have an old Good Housekeeping and a few other old magazines like that. Now, you may have heard of Fannie Farmer's cookbook. Did we get there yet? Oh, no, we got the baking powder. I should have made myself a copy of this. I'm sorry. Okay, here is Rumford's complete cookbook. Rumford was from Rumford, Rhode Island, and they were one of the earliest American companies to make baking powder. Now, in case you don't know, baking powder, baking soda, and yeast can all cause dough to rise or batter, right? Baking soda has to have an acid in the recipe. So lots of recipes that are raised with baking soda also use sour milk to give it the acid. Baking powder is baking soda with an acid, calcium or aluminum sulfate usually. And some people don't like to use the aluminum one, so they look for the calcium non-aluminum one. Anyway, Royal Baking Powder, I remember this one from when I was a kid. I don't know if they're still making it or not. This was Rumford, and I remember the name. This is a little book. They had made a bazillion editions. They have a picture of Count Rumford, who was the founder. This is, I don't know if you can see the length of this page. This is the number of editions this book went out. And this one is from 1930 something. And they've got a few black and white pictures in here, just a few. And lots of recipes and other information. This is pretty sturdy, so you can look at that if you would like. If you put on the table, please. Okay, so now, this is a product that Royal Baking Powder made that was similar to Knox gelatin, but they had added the fruit flavors. So that would be a product that was similar to Jell-O, which absolutely took over from this product because we never have heard of this one. Okay. Here's Fannie. Okay. Now, she is famous not for her chocolates, because I don't even know if she had anything to do with the Fannie Farmer chocolates, but they certainly used her name. And she was born in 1857. And she published an edition that was the first an early American cookbook, published in 1896. She couldn't get anybody interested in publishing her cookbook, so she published it herself. And guess what? She kept the copyright, and she became very, very rich from this product because the cookbook took off. It's still available on Amazon and other places in a facsimile edition. However, this is one of the newer ones. This came out in 1996, and a woman named Marion Cunningham, who was a prolific cookbook author, adopted the recipes. Fannie's first cookbook, and there's a picture of it in our museum cookbook, had 1,200 recipes. This one had almost 2,000. I believe it's still in print. Fannie was born in 1857, and she had polio, which left her with a serious limp for the rest of her life. She entered the Boston Cooking School and became in charge shortly after her graduation. Now, cooking schools were popular. This is in the last decade of the 1800s, because remember we talked about the girls leaving the farm and going to work in households in more urban areas. Now they're leaving the households to go work in the factories, because they maybe have a shorter day, although that wasn't a particularly short day, and probably made more money. So nobody knew how to cook because everybody had cooks. Even what we call middle-class people had cooks. So the cooking school started. She entered the Boston School, graduated, and became in charge shortly after her graduation. She left there, started her own school, and her alma mater closed a few years later. Now, she wasn't such a great cook, but she was a great executive. In the preface to the first edition of her cookbook, she wrote, "It is my wish that it may not only be looked at as a compilation of tried and tested recipes, but that it may awaken an interest through its condensed scientific knowledge, which will lead to deeper thought and broader study of what to eat." Her recipe used salt and pepper, and also cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, dried ginger, cloves. Those are all in the cookies that I made for today. Mustard, vinegar, horseradish, and capers, which I didn't know we ever had capers that long ago, plus vanilla and fruit extracts, lemon extract, orange extract, and such. By 1990, more than 4 million copies of that cookbook had been sold. The original book had 1,200 dependable recipes, and they were dependable because she insisted on accurate measurements rather than handful, pinch, and so forth, as we saw on the slides. And she didn't invent them, but she was the one that really made them standardized. Fannie lectured widely and gave her final talk from her wheelchair 10 days before her death. Immigration and migration also affected many changes in our diets. The first pizzeria opened in New York City in 1905. Anybody surprised that it was that long ago? And none of these old cookbooks have recipes for spaghetti and meatballs. So they might have macaroni and cheese. We saw that one for ham and cheese, macaroni and cheese. Even today, our family diets are influenced by so many factors: where we live, our ethnicity, our religion, our economic status, as well as what we like. I talked about that earlier. Betty, let's have the lights on, please. Yeah. And is this our last slide?
I think it is.
Yeah. All right. So I'll stand up here and I'll show you. Betty Crocker. How many of you have ever seen a Betty Crocker cookbook or used one? Okay. This is a first edition. It's been very well used. I think I won this when I was a senior in high school because I scored the highest on the Betty Crocker Homemaker Tomorrow exam. Anybody ever hear of that? You got a book too. Okay. So I was looking I couldn't find mine. I finally found it yesterday in the back of a closet because it's really falling apart. Somebody had a new copy for $300. Get out, right? Okay. It says in the front of this book, so a little bit about testing recipes. This is a new picture cookbook. They're most thoroughly tested of any now being offered. Each basic recipe in this book has been tested at least 100 times. And after careful testing in the Betty Crocker kitchens by trained home economists, further tests are made by homemakers just like you in cities, towns, and rural areas. Every recipe approved by Betty Crocker has been pronounced successful at home kitchens as one family acceptance. And it has 48 pages of color photographs, which was a lot. This was published in 1960 or 61. They also had these interesting little blue pages at the beginning of sections where they talked about a little bit about the background, like maybe who did the first whatever, or like the sandwich or who invented soups. And here's you can see that this was very well used. I used to say to my mother, why do your cookbooks look like this? And now I have some that look even worse. Here's an example of a colored photograph.
Can I say something, if you don't mind?
I don't mind.
Okay. I was watching.
taught
a
high school,
show
you
on
know.
TV the other night, and I think it was Porn Stars, you know, where people bring things in. They brought something signed by Betty Crocker, and during that program, they said Betty Crocker wasn't a real person.
No, I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
She was invented by General Mills, and she used to sign. And I have somewhere a picture of Betty Crocker, like what she first looked like. I think she first appeared in like 1958 or so.
Mhm.
And then you've got pictures of her. Dot.
They had a contest in the night, I think around 2000.
Yeah, 2000 or so.
And it ended up, my sister-in-law was 1/62nd of that picture. It was composed of all these people, so I'm not sure if it was.
I remember that. I do remember that.
Full of Betty Crocker stuff out.
Yeah. There's dozens and dozens, well, maybe not dozens, but there are a whole lot of different Betty Crocker cookbooks. They publish specialized ones. I had a great one when my kids were growing up that showed you how to cut up a cake and make a train out of it, and and all those kinds of things. That was fabulous. There's an international Betty Crocker, but there was no Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker is a
Yeah, I think they chose the name Betty because it was a very
common name.
And Crocker was the name of one of the executives within the company.
And it sounds a little bit like
So,
cooking.
Yeah, I guess so. Crocker. Yeah. I thought that was fascinating.
So she was created by General Mills, and they did update her because the backs of some of the cookbooks have a picture of her. You've probably seen, if you have a cookbook, look on the back and see if you've got a picture.
She got older as the years came.
She did. And well, not necessarily older, but her look changed, her hairdo and her glasses and maybe her clothing. I'm not sure they really wanted her to look older. Joy of Cooking is another iconic cookbook. This was my mom's, who was married in 1941, well used. And very few pictures, some illustrations, but no colored pictures in this book. This book has been published and is still published. And right here I have, I think this is the latest, or it's a recent edition of The Joy of Cooking. Look at the size difference.
I think the grandson's doing it now.
Yes, her grandson, Ethan Becker, is now working on, and her daughter. The annoying thing about this book is, if you start on a recipe that's on page 46, and then all of a sudden you have to go back to page 72 or something to do the next part. So I personally find that annoying, but if you need to know how to dress the rabbit, it's in here. It's still in that one, okay? That too, probably. Or the frog's legs, because one of my son's fraternity brothers came to the farm one day, and he says, oh, there's frogs out there. He made a jig out of a hacksaw blade, and he came back with frog legs. Tastes like chicken, because I had to try it. We talked about the home economists and the food companies. Ida Bailey Allen was, I believe, a home economist. She published a series of cookbooks. This is called the Service Cookbook #2. Got this at a yard sale someplace. Published especially for F.W. Woolworth. So these were sold only in their stores. Interesting way they put the recipes. I don't know if you can see this, but you got the ingredients here and the directions here, and they fit a whole lot on the page. Yeah, well, I definitely would need my reading glasses. Here's kale. My daughter's favorite vegetable, kale and watercress salad. And then with Italian dressing, those two greens and Italian dressing. Okay, so there's that one.
Yes.
And I think the three iconic books are Joy of Cooking, Betty Crocker, and I don't have a really old Better Homes and Gardens. I have a new one that I use. How many have a Better Homes and Gardens cookbook? Oh. It's interesting, the Joy of Cooking. I gave one to a bride-to-be one day, and she looked at it and she said, huh, must be the power of positive thinking. She would rather be outside. This book, if you're interested in this topic and would like to know more, this is called The American Century Cookbook. It's by Jean Anderson. It is not in print anymore. My sister gave me this for a Christmas present. It was published in the mid-90s, before the end of the century. So I guess she didn't think anything was going to happen in the last 5 years. But many copies are available online for $5 plus shipping from used or lightly used. And I've had very good luck with ordering secondhand books because they are pretty truthful. They tell you it's in excellent condition, or it's like new, or it's a library edition, or whatever. So if you really like to know more about food, and it's got good recipes in it, she was a good recipe developer, and it has, here's a whole thing about beef stroganoff.
Have you made a lot of recipes out of it?
I have made quite a few recipes out of here. Here's a whole thing about perfection salad. Anybody ever make perfection salad? Has gelatin in it, usually green, cabbage, celery. Actually, this one this uses Knox's gelatin, not Jell-O, okay? This is one of the finest salads I have ever had, made with Knox's gelatin. It can be served in so many different ways. I'm going to have this salad served at our next church supper, where we feed from 200 to 250 people. It's especially fine with fried oysters. And they use this in an ad for Knox gelatin, of course, okay? So it has cabbage. It's gelatin with celery, cabbage. This one says sweet red peppers or carrots in it, you know. My mother used to make it. So I do, if you enjoy this topic, you would enjoy this book. And the recipes are also good, but there's a lot of history. She has something about each year from 1900 to 1995 or so. Who would like to take a guess how many cookbooks were sold in 2020?
Probably more than 20.
No, very few, because everybody goes online.
Very few, because everybody goes online, okay? On your phone. Why, Ellen?
Because it's easier to have the cookbook in front of you instead of worrying about your screen getting messed up. And so many people were home in 2020 trying to learn new things. They were buying things.
Very astute, yes. I personally hate I look up recipes online, but I almost always print them out because I can't stand it because my screen goes dead in the middle of it. And then I have to start it again. So here's the number. 21.5 million cookbooks were sold in 2020, in spite of the widely available recipes available in magazines like Bon Appetit, and Rachel Ray and Woman's Day and all those magazines, newspapers and online. So Cathy and I really enjoyed creating this book for the museum. Cathy tested most of the recipes and figured out how to interpret them for today's cooks. We hope you will enjoy trying them for your families. And think about the difficulty that our grandmothers had in cooking for and cooking up, cleaning up after their families. So any questions that haven't been asked? That I don't mind being interrupted because I used to teach high school, so you know.
I just have a quick question that, just doing research for this and the Catskill Farmhouse, it seems like they ate a lot of jellied things. Is that right?
Yeah, aspic. How many people have had tomato aspic? My grandmother used to make that. I kind of liked it because I like V8 juice and it kind of has that same kind of a taste. But they had a lot. I mean, one of Dick's aunts gave me a whole bunch of molds and all different shapes and everything. There were little ring molds and there were little, like a custard cup with fluted edges and all those. I don't know if they've ever used any of them, but that was a big thing in the 50s, the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I have a book I didn't bring today, and it's called The Diary of Regrettable Food. And this man has, well, maybe we could do it part 2. This man took,
No testing recipes.
no testing recipes. Things that his family moved to some town in, I'm going to say Minnesota, but someplace in the Midwest. And the welcome wagon came and brought all these brochures with recipes and stuff in, maybe from the factories that were in that town. I mean, I'm not really sure. I don't remember the details. Mostly he has colored pictures of these things. And honestly, they look so unappetizing to my contemporary eyes that I wouldn't consider making it. And I probably wouldn't want to taste it if you put it on the table. And there's another woman who wrote a book called Perfection Salad. That one doesn't have all the illustrations, but I just talked about Perfection Salad. And some of those, you jellied everything. We were talking about it the other day at Quilt Group and said, oh yeah, my grandmother used to put black olives and cottage cheese and something else in Jell-O, and that was thing. But we were married in 1964. Okay, now I'm a graduate of Cornell's College of Home Economics. And so I'm cooking in a kitchen that has, I told you what the refrigerator looked like. And we had an electric stove that we got with this old farmhouse that we were fixing up. And it had a wire element. It was like a twisted wire, like coiled wire. And that was in the bottom of the oven. And I would turn that on to cook something, whether I was going to cook something or I was going to bake something. And I would go back to check on it and the thing would have burned through. So then the stove was cold. And so when